Welcome to Defy These Times, a podcast dedicated to the easy task of tackling the 21st century. It is a project born out of my conviction that doing so requires an interdisciplinary and intersectional approach to understanding our complex world. I'm your host Jasbir Puar, and in these episodes I bring you conversations at the intersection of politics, history, philosophy, culture, science, and all the fun stuff in between. The following episode was first published for monthly Patreon supporters. To become a monthly Patreon supporter, please head out to patreon.com/firethesetimes or check the website for other methods. You can become a supporter for as little as $1 a month. And if you cannot donate, you can still support this project by sharing with your friends and family and leaving a review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. The music of this podcast is by Tarabit. Here's the episode. Hey everyone, in light of what's been happening in Palestine over recent weeks, I decided to reshare a conversation from last year with Mohammed Sulaiman. He is a Palestinian writer and researcher who grew up in Gaza and who currently works at the University of South Australia. The core of our conversation was Mohammed's two essays for Hummus For Thought, my previous blog, which is currently a monthly newsletter, and the essays are called Wretched of the Earth, Thoughts on Syria, Palestine and Discourse, and the second essay is called Israel and quote-unquote the right to maim. Among the topics that we discussed were growing up in Gaza and surviving the Israeli wars and blockade, his and his partner's difficulty journey to Australia, himself via Israel and herself via Egypt, the Western left's failures on Syria and Bosnia as well as its relationships to Palestine, the dehumanization of Palestinians and Syrians, Israel's politics of domination, Israel's right to maim as inherent to colonial logic through Jasbir Puar's work, and Palestinians being asked to show gratitude by self-appointed quote-unquote saviors. So, as I said, this is a conversation that was recorded last year, in June of last year to be specific, so it is not about what's been happening specifically in the past couple of weeks, but I thought that the topics that we discussed were very much, unfortunately, still relevant, so I'm resharing it today. Thanks for listening everyone and take care.
My name is Mohammed Sulaiman. I currently work at University of South Australia, where I am based in South Australia. I came to Australia in 2015 to do my PhD in sociology, which I finished earlier this year. And before that, obviously, I'm Palestinian from Gaza, or, from somewhere in 1948, Palestine. Called Algia, which is a small village close to, or is part of Ashkelon, or what is really is called Ashkelon. And I before I came to Australia, I worked for a human rights organization in Gaza. I did some journalism, and I spent a year in London where I did my master's in human rights. My first degree is in English literature. That's it.
Amazing. So we'll start with an essay that you wrote in 2016, which is entitled Wretched of the Earth, Thoughts on Syria, Palestine and Discourse. And this was published on Hummus For Thought, which is a blog that I've been running for some years now. And I will read a quote here, which is just at the beginning of the text for some people to kind of get the gist of what we'll be talking about in this first part of the conversation. And so I'm quoting now. What happens in Syria is of a great concern to all of us, albeit for different reasons. My concern for Syria is the loss of hundreds of thousands of civilian lives and, no less important, the way my identity as a Palestinian is constantly dragged into it to justify this bloodbath and undermine the struggle of Syrians. It's been 4 years since you've written this. Obviously, the gist, unfortunately, you could have written it today and it would have been just as relevant, I think. But can you explain for listeners who may not know the details why this is and was such a sensitive and important topic to you, and what is it about?
Yeah, I mean, as I state in that piece that I wrote for Hummus For Thought, the issue basically is that the discourse around the Syrian revolution since the very beginning in March 2011, or correct me if I'm wrong, there has been a lot of attempts, probably almost orchestrated, in order to delegitimize the struggle of Syrians for obviously freedom, for democracy, for all the ideals that we are always taught to embrace and promote and practice. But obviously, the attempt to delegitimize the Syrian struggle was unfortunately based on the relationship between the Syrian regime and the Palestinian people. And the narrative goes that the Syrian regime is a champion of Palestinian rights, of Palestinian liberation, and that it has a normalized relations with Israel, blah, blah, blah. We all know that stuff. So, and therefore I felt that there was a need for a voice from within the, Palestinian. I'll try and refrain, from using particular terminology, but from within Palestinian civil society itself in order to air the general feeling amongst the lay Palestinian, amongst the actual everyday Palestinians that you meet, anywhere in Palestine or around the world. Obviously, people are always divided, so you will always have people who side with the Syrian regime, or others who will support the Palestinian struggle. But the issue for me is that there was almost, like I said, hegemonic narrative that there is something unique about the Syrian struggle, which is that the regime that is being fought against by the people is actually a champion of Palestinian rights, and therefore that makes the Syrian struggle somehow less credible and legitimate. And therefore, that was for me the issue, that was the fundamental problematic that I tried to challenge, or at least I've spent the first early years of my engagement with the Syrian revolution trying to debunk this narrative by simply questioning the ideological underpinnings of this discourse, which is basically that everything centers around Palestinians, and that, because somehow a group of people who are not involved either in the Syrian struggle or in the Palestinian struggle, or they are not particularly a part of it. They might be some sort of a global movement that tries to promote these rights, but then in their attempt to promote Palestinian rights, they sadly ended up committing the same mistakes and the same injustices against other peoples, only because it did not fit with their particular ideological framework and how they viewed the world. So it was just a reminder that we need to go back to the basics. The basics are very simple. If you just stick to them, you will be able to navigate the complexity of the geopolitical map of the Middle East, or anywhere you go, basically, that people are entitled to express to fight for their freedoms, to mobilize, to, so we talk about all these ideals of sovereignty, of democracy, like I said, of popular uprisings and all that stuff. And then when that happens and it's just right there in front of us, we resort to those mythical. We start, creating narratives in order to just somehow make sense of something that does not neatly fit with what we have already preconceived. So that's the issue here. There is a narrative and there is a reality, and we just need to reconcile the two. And the narrative is that, like I said, the Syrian uprising is a plot, is a conspiracy, and so on and so forth. Again, obviously, it's always more nuanced. We understand that there are states, that there are, powers, and I do also buy into particular. I don't claim that we know everything, but we all know that there are, the monarchies in the region. We know that Israel is there. We know that there are all these global powers which are invested in shaping the map in particular ways. But for us as people, I think the concern and the starting point has always to be with the people. with what is going on, and from there we can go upwards and start to make sense of the complexity. But we shouldn't talk down on people and try just to shape reality in a way that just is convenient for us, because we don't want to challenge ourselves.
Absolutely. Um, your piece at the time really helped me think through some things. It was in the weeks before the fall of Aleppo, obviously at the end of 2016, and emotions among Syrian friends were obviously quite high, to put it very mildly. At the same time, or at the time actually, I was still trying to engage online with Assadists, and since I'm from Lebanon, especially like with Hezbollah supporters and everything, which to be honest, since then I've mostly given up on. I'm trying to focus on other things. But as you know, I mean, as you mentioned here, like part of the big credentials, so to speak, is what they use as justifications, the road to Jerusalem passes through Aleppo, whatever the latest iteration of it is. And in the reason why I wanted to ask you as well, like, how have you seen this? Have you thought about this maybe in the past few years, whether that's changed or not? Is that in the context of Lebanon, obviously we've had the uprising since October and of 2019, and I've started seeing some sort of cracks in this hegemonic narrative that I personally had given up on, just like in seeing. I thought that we're just not going to happen. We're not going to see it anytime soon. And what I'm talking about here is the fact that, for example, whereas in before October, essentially, it was extremely taboo to talk about Syria in the context of Lebanon. It was partly due to the history, the Syrian occupation, obviously, the sensitivity of all of this in general, which I no need to get into the details here, since there are other episodes that I've done on this specifically. But I started seeing some people from southern Lebanon, some friends of mine who have families that are very close or even members of Hezbollah, sort of kind of be a bit more open about just trying to say that they are supporting, if they want to if basically the narrative would be like, if we want to support our rights here, we cannot deny the fact that Syrians also have the right to defend their own rights in Syria. And so this created a whole lot of questions. So I wanted to ask you is, when so this was in 2016, which is a very specific year when it comes to Syrian history, as I said, in the weeks before the fall of Aleppo. But since then, have you seen this narrative sort of develop into something else, or has it really just been the same one and not much change has been done on that front, do you think?
That's a good question, actually, Joey. But to be honest, personally, I'm not probably as much as involved as I used to be, and I've never been deeply involved. Simply because, I just don't think I have what it takes to constantly follow all this stuff. It just really doesn't, I'd rather keep, try and follow how this unfolds. But at the same time, I'm aware that it can get very toxic, which can, directly really undermine your general well-being, or general. It could really make you feel very, very depressed. So
Absolutely. No, and that's fair enough. That's fair enough. And I should say that, like, what you've been through since 2014. I mean, obviously since before then as well, but especially since 2014, is something that I actually wanted to get into a bit as well, if that's okay with you.
Yeah.
Because, and actually, I don't think I've ever mentioned this to you, but in 2014, during the war on Gaza, I was a volunteer at Global Voices. I since became the MENA editor until last year, and my focus was entirely on the war in Gaza. And the part of the Twitter threads that I was, or the tweets, sorry, the Twitter accounts that I was using back then was yours, and I remember some of those in unfortunately chilling details, which I'm sure for you
Yeah.
was like exponentially worse, obviously.
Yeah.
Can we talk a bit about I will get to the second essay that you wrote on Hummus For Thought in a bit, but can we talk a bit about 2014. Obviously, in as many details as you feel comfortable. You don't have to get into everything, but how you were trying to document everything that was going on through Twitter. I don't know, maybe on Facebook as well. I don't remember. But how do you remember that experience and trying to confer what you were experiencing to the world through social media at the time, and what you had to endure after that, as well as since you left Gaza to do your PhD in Australia, the time that took, of course, which you were telling me in our pre-chat, if you can mention that as well, and the difficulties as well in getting your wife, who was pregnant at the time with your child, out of Gaza as well to join you in Australia.
Yeah, of course I can talk about all of that. It's just I'm aware that you actually raised a good question, and I don't want to pass up that question because
Sure.
I think it's crucial to address it when you talk about the change in narrative or the lack of change in narrative around Syria.
Mm-hmm.
The thing I would like to remind us all is that this particular discourse that we have highlighted at the start
Mm-hmm.
is not particular to Syria,
No.
because we all know that this was also the same segment of the left, the global left, or particularly the Western left, which is a word that I like to repeatedly emphasize when I try to, navigate the, political nuances of the region. Now, and I will explain why, particularly coming from a post-colonial perspective. Now, this was the case, we know, in Bosnia, for example, right? And
Absolutely.
we know that it was the same elements of the left that continued to promulgate that idea or that narrative that,
Absolutely.
Not everything that happens in in these regions is particularly driven by the need for change, by the need for freedom or democracy or justice or equality and rights and so on and so forth. It becomes more of an issue between global powers, between states, where people ultimately dissolve and disappear from the whole picture. They just become ultimately objects, objects in the sense that they are either victims or terrorists, to quote someone. They mentioned how, for example, in order, those people stop being actors in the sense that they become perceived as incapable of creating change. And if they do prove that they are capable of creating that change, then, like I said, if that like what happened in Syria with the revolution, like what happened in across the Arab world, when that revolution is not in line with the ideological worldview of these people, then that change becomes labeled as terrorist or as a conspiracy and so on and so forth, because these people have proven that they are capable of creating change. So on the one hand, we are victims. We just need sympathy. We just need support. We just need help. But when we actually take action and prove that we're capable of making change, then like what's happening in Syria and like what's happening in Gaza. So let's not forget Gaza, because all of this happened first in Gaza in 2006, right? The irony is, when it happened in Gaza, when people voted in Gaza, right, the first democratic experience in the Middle East, everybody talks about it in those terms. We voted wrong. We voted Hamas into power. But we still did, we still created history. We actually, because we're always told, Orientals, people in the Middle East, right? That's what we called. We are somewhat less capable of, constructing our societies in a free, democratic way, because that's the ideal model, the universal model that everybody's got to follow. But when we actually did that, we were punished because, again, we didn't do it. Yes, we followed the procedures and all that, but somehow the outcome wasn't consistent with the interests of the dominant powers in the region and more globally.
Mm-hmm.
So in the case of Palestine, in the case of Gaza, we know that the reaction was globally, unanimous in its opposition to Hamas,
Mm-hmm.
right? So we are still being punished for that. I don't know, fast forward, probably 20 years now.
Mm-hmm.
Now, on the other hand, in Syria, the people did also take action. The people did actually drive change. They, like in Egypt, like in Tunisia, like everywhere.
Yeah.
But again, the issue is that this change was not also in line with the particular worldview of particular segment of the left. So in the case of Palestine, it wasn't the left. The left was, we know, wholeheartedly behind the Palestinian struggle and still is.
Mm-hmm.
But my question now, what does that tell me? What motivates the leftist support for Palestinians?
Mm-hmm.
If they fail to provide the same support for Syrians, it clearly, there is something unique about the Palestinian case that allows everyone to converge around them
Mm-hmm.
and support them. But it probably not because they are Palestinians and worthy of freedom. It could be because of something else that we have to make sense of.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I'm trying to make sense of that. Why is it easy to support Palestinians, but so hard to support Syrians for
Mm-hmm.
these people? So I'm talking here from that perspective. But what this brings me back to is the point here about how the distinction which you raised between the left and the right becomes almost obsolete from the perspective of the colonial subjects, from the perspective of a Palestinian or a Syrian. Because if the left has failed to support Syrians and has used the Palestinians in order to undermine their struggle, they have failed to support, people in Bosnia, like their stance in, towards the Khmer Rouge and all those. So there is a consistent failure within the left. And obviously, when you challenge that, somehow there is an arcane resemblance between the left and the right in the way they treat the people that they are supposed to be in solidarity with.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm here referring to racism and privilege in particular, the way they try to undermine and oppress these people, not necessarily politically, but at least ideologically and in terms of their discourse, in terms of how, for example, people like, yourself, Joey, you come from a place like, from Lebanon, you
Mm-hmm.
have all these experiences, but at the same time, because you're able to articulate yourself in particular ways in order to promote a social justice narrative in the region
Mm-hmm.
that challenges the worldview of these people, you become a hostile enemy
Mm-hmm.
in the eyes of these people who are supposed to be, for example, in solidarity with the region.
Mm-hmm.
But again, it's not the region that they care about, or it's not really Palestinians. That's how I see things. It's a warped worldview that they are invested in sustaining by any means necessary. So if that means we, fabricate stories, we call the white helmets terrorists, we do whatever we want, they will do whatever it takes, in my opinion, in order to spread that narrative. Of course, they will create their own, they will say facts. Our facts show us this, facts and data, evidence, and everybody's fighting about evidence.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's a futile effort. I'm not saying there is no evidence, there are no facts, but I'm saying there are facts, and these facts will always be distorted and used in particular ways to support different narratives.
Mm-hmm.
Now, that's why for us, we need to go back to the starting point. What is this about? It's about the Syrian people, right? They have decided, or the revolution started. Had it been anywhere else, we wouldn't have an issue. We would have all supported the people like we supported the people in Egypt, in Tunisia. But in Syria in particular, they have failed to do that. And of course, their issue is that it's because of, the relationship between Syria and Palestine and, the role that Israel, so always, Israel is the bogeyman, and that somehow the failure of the Syrian regime is going to make things worse for Palestinians. which is ludicrous. What is whether Assad stays or perishes really has no bearing on the relationship between Israel and Palestine, in my opinion. So, to cut a long story short, the narrative, whether it has changed or not, is really it's not just about Syria. It's a narrative that is so constant, and it has been going on for decades. And it just tells us something about the relationship in my opinion, between the West and the non-West. And it tells us something about the colonial interaction. So it's not just about Syria, in my opinion, or Palestine, or particular states. It's about, in at least as how I see things, it's about the interaction between the West and the non-West. Which again, we see manifestations of this when we talk about Black Lives Matters as well. When we talk about all these things, it's a global struggle that is historically grounded in, all the colonial experiences that occurred over the past few centuries, and which we, what we live today is basically a continuation or an outcome or a consequence of, and has to be seen in continuity with that history rather than in separation from it.
That's a very good point. A very good point. Thanks for expanding on that. I completely agree, obviously. And as I said, this is something that I've been struggling with, and it got to the point where I mean, I'm not too proud of saying this, to be honest, but I got to the point where at some point I stopped saying that I'm part Palestinian because my grandfather is from Haifa. And it just got to the point where it was in 2015, 2016. And I was very close to a friend who's at SOAS, who's a Palestinian from Yarmouk, so a Palestinian Syrian from Yarmouk refugee camp in Syria. And he had been going through a lot of difficulties being openly Palestinian online and being openly Syrian at the same time from various groups. If it's in Arabic, he might get some of the more what we might call like shabiha types. If it's in English, then it's more like the Western quote unquote anti-imperialist, leftist, tankies, whatever we want to call them types. And yeah, it just got to the point where obviously I would never deny it. If anyone talks to me and asks me, I would just say there's never been any shame associated with that as far as I was concerned. But I kind of took a step back in a sense online. It wasn't something that I was comfortable saying because already as a Lebanese talking about Syria, you might have some nuances that can be lost because people just think that you have other motives. So to have both a Palestinian Lebanese, let's say, or Lebanese Palestinian, talking about consistently opposing what Israel was doing in Gaza, for example, in 2014, as I said, in that context. And then the year later, or 2015, 2016, talking more about Eastern Ghouta at the time, or obviously Halab, Aleppo, and so on. It just put me in this very weird positions where I kept on clashing with the random groups that sometimes found commonalities with one another and sometimes not. So as you mentioned before, like there's a lot of toxicity involved with all of this. And I had to take a step back in a sense before getting back into it more comfortably later on, I guess. If we can talk a bit about your journey from 2014, leaving Gaza, going to Australia, the difficulties in leaving Gaza in the first place, how long that took, and the difficulties you had in trying to bring over your wife as well, who was pregnant at the time with your firstborn. And yeah, if we can just talk a bit about this for those who don't know how difficult it can actually be.
Yes, of course. I left Gaza in April 2015 and came here to South Australia to do my PhD. And at the time, I got all my papers, all sort of my visa, my documentation. I quit my job, and so did my wife, Layla. And we were preparing to leave. If you live in Gaza, you don't just leave. You have to plan. Like there is almost at least a couple months, depending on the general political situation, but it could take sometimes a year. A lot of people just end up, not leaving, just not being able to go get treatment in, for example, hospitals outside of Gaza. Students miss out on their scholarships, on their grants, and so it's all, for a lack of a better word, precarious, which is such an understatement. But for me, I got all my papers. I started planning to leave. I couldn't, obviously, because at the time it was just right after the end of the Israeli assault in 2014. And if you want to leave Gaza, there is two ways. You can leave either through the north, through the areas crossing with Israel. So that's, in the north of Gaza. And you can apply for a special permit with the Israeli authorities through the Palestinian Civil Administration. And if you get that permit, then you get a sort of a day, like 1 day visa. Like it's like just
Like
a
pass.
passerby, just to pass through Israel and get to the West Bank, and then you can cross from the West Bank to into Jordan. So even if you want to do that, you also have to apply for a permit with the Jordanian authorities. We call it Adam Mumana, as in like they don't mind you passing through their territory, which is what I'm saying. Like this is how a Palestinian is treated.
Yeah.
It's a scandal to be a Palestinian.
Yeah.
Or in the political sense, it's like you're unwelcome anywhere. And now I applied for that permit. At the time we were pregnant with Adam, who's now 5 years. And we quit our jobs. We just wanted to leave to come here, and we couldn't because we got normally these permits as well. It's because it's very bureaucratized. There are always tens of thousands of permits at any one time that are being applied for and processed. So it's just a complete state of uncertainty. There's nothing that you can bank on, like you can't plan. So we got a rejections. Like we applied 3 times. Each time we would, it would take a month or 2, and then you get a rejection. And at the same time, we were trying to cross through the south. So that's the other exit with the crossing with Egypt through the Sinai desert. And that because at the time it was just in the wake of the Sisi coup, the military coup in Egypt. So they were just still cracking down on Hamas, and they have just at the time they had just shut the border completely, the Rafah crossing, and they also were destroying the tunnels which were operating for a couple of years while the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, Morsi, were in power. So we couldn't get through either, and we were stuck eventually. And just out of the blue, we stepped up our efforts, and I got a permit to leave, but that Layla was denied a permit, so I left on my own. And I left Layla behind, and I came here through Ares, a very traumatic journey, because it was the first time for me to actually go to the West Bank. Not go, because I didn't go there, I just passed.
You passed, yeah.
So it literally were like 3 hours. And obviously, so that's the only time I actually stepped foot in the West Bank. And you go to Jerusalem as well. Some of us were like students who wanted to, because that was the first time they go to Jerusalem, they wanted to see the city. I was like, I don't think we have time to do anything. We'd better just, go straight to the crossing. Some of us actually did because again, like, it's not something as a Palestinian from Gaza that that's one in a lifetime opportunity. And obviously also the terminal with Jordan as well, you get interrogated. Some of us were turned back even after, like, we were actually the last people to leave the areas crossing. So like I said, it's very, very dehumanizing, very humiliating. It's not befitting of a human being to be treated regardless. For me, like, if you just want to again look at it very simply, it's just there's something fundamentally problematic about this entire setup. And that's what I'm saying. These are the injustices that people are still unable to talk about. It's not just about, of course, bombing, destruction, death, but the level of control that the Israelis exert over Palestinian life is ubiquitous. It's just thorough and absolute. They have absolute control over every aspect of your life. And then we got here. Layla, luckily for her, after a couple of months, managed to get out through the Rafah crossing. So that's the crossing with Egypt. Obviously, the Egyptian military at the time were fighting or trying to, combat the ISIS, offshoots in the Sinai Desert. So there was a lot of shooting going on. It wasn't a safe journey. It was, very dangerous. But eventually, you have to, if you go through Egypt, you have to take a ride that goes for like 9 hours until you get to the Cairo International Airport. That's literally any person from Gaza that wants to travel out of Gaza, they have to go this way or that way. So that's how it works. That's the, when people talk about Gaza being a prison, it's not a metaphor. It actually is a literal description. So and we're here now.
Well, alhamdulillah, at least.
Exactly.
You mentioned the system of control being ubiquitous of the Israeli occupation. You wrote this other essay, what was it, in 2017, I think, which is called Israel and the Right to Maim. Let's get into this a bit, because when you wrote this essay, it's also published on Hummus For Thought. All of these things, I'll link them in the description, obviously. It's about the Israeli practice of purposefully maiming Palestinians, especially in Gaza, but not just in Gaza. It was written, if I remember well, shortly after the murder of Ibrahim Abu Thuraya by Israeli forces, and that was in December 2017. And his story is particularly gruesome because he was already a double amputee since 2008, since the war in 2008, the bombings in 2008. You mentioned this point, you mentioned this argument, and I'll let you get into it a bit, that we don't know much about Palestinians who are quote unquote just injured. It ends up being since the numbers are obviously significantly larger than the numbers of killed, which are themselves fairly high in most of the bombardments or the wars by the Israeli government, we end up kind of not focusing on it as much. And there was this book that I'm sure you can talk about a bit more. I haven't actually read it yet, unfortunately. But I think, if I'm not mistaken, in that book, they also go into the example of Kashmir, because that happens in Kashmir quite a lot as well, by the Indian army. This quote unquote right to maim is obviously put in quotations. Is it like just complementary to the, again, quote unquote right to kill? Is it an inherent component of colonial logic, colonial dominance? And is it just as important? And sorry, these are too many questions at the same time anyway, but why everything I just asked, and as well, why is it not thought about as much as, let's say, for example, something as more direct as murder?
Yes, just flagging up that this Right to Maim is actually a book written by Jasbir Puar, published by Duke University Press. So I was merely okay. I'm engaged in somewhat now. Okay, I'll fix it later. Sorry, Joey.
No worries.
Okay, beautiful. Thank you. So we were talking about this book, and I was merely trying to just sort of promote it in a way, and it's a thorough study of the Israeli army's practices, and it does, like you mentioned, sort of draw our attention to something that probably prior to this we've all known, but we've never really talked about or adequately emphasized and tried to understand the dangers of this sort of practice, in terms of how we tend to think that it's natural that there will be a huge discrepancy between how many people are murdered and how are maimed or injured. Right, but then we didn't understand that this was actually a deliberate policy. That's the key point here. It's not because for us, we would assume that an Israeli F-16 would drop a bomb, and then some people will die and others will be injured, and this is a natural discrepancy. But when you think about the Israeli, when you read that book and start actually observing more closely the logic of the right to maim, and how Israel actually and the Israeli army embraces and embodies that practice, in terms of how it deliberately attempts and intends to in a way injure or inflict as much damage upon Palestinians as possible, even if that means just shooting to maim. In that regard, the story of Abu Thuraya is very symbolic, because this like you say, he was a double amputee, and that was the first where, for example, maybe in that instance, that injury was coincidental. It wasn't deliberate. Obviously, I'm here just speaking hypothetically. So if in 2008 he was amputated because of a bomb, which was the case here, that Israel in no way intended to. Maybe they just dropped the bomb, and then he got they didn't know that there was a person called Abu Thuraya, and we were just trying to beam him. So that was not planned. But then that's the natural outcome of the Israeli policy. Fast forward 10 or 11 years, and then he's engaged in this protest along the buffer zone with Israel, and then we see how he is basically shot dead. And now why? For me, obviously, I'm reading into this, and I'm saying here, first we shoot to maim. That's always the aim, because we want to, obviously, the idea that people who are injured endure less suffering than those who are murdered is here nonsensical. It just doesn't make sense, because we tend to focus on how many people are killed, like we have just said, and we forget that in almost a daily basis, there are injuries that are inflicted upon the Palestinians by the Israeli army. Now, these injuries have permanent consequences on the victims. It's not like, that's why we're talking here, like the right to maim, but the subtitle of that book was Debility, Capacity, and Disability. And here we talk about a distinction between disability, which is, which is different from debility. Where when we talk about disability, people with disabilities and all that, it's more of a generic term to describe, whereas debility, it becomes the something that is inflicted with upon the victim with intention. So it becomes more of a policy, more of an ideology, more of something that, there is something unique about the disability of a Palestinian victim of an Israeli shooting than a natural disability of, now, and that uniqueness needed to be communicated, in my opinion, because we can't just lump all these people, like, I don't know the figures, but there are definitely tens of thousands of disabilities that have been inflicted upon the Palestinians by the Israeli army over the past years. So we needed someone to be able to articulate that to us and communicate to us the cruelty and the brutality of the Israeli interaction with the Palestinians, and how it's not just simply about controlling them and killing them. It's as ubiquitous as that, they decide, for example, to shoot in the right arm, in the left arm, and then these stories will go unnoticed because it's just another injury. We would assume that it's, they couldn't shoot them in the head, they couldn't kill them, it just ended up in their arm. What if, in fact, that was the intention? To shoot in the arm, to shoot to maim in the first place. And I think that's what's going on here. That's why, all these protests along the Green Line, there is always, as a Palestinian, probably you can also relate, if you live in a volatile area like this, where there's always confrontations with soldiers. This is how I grew up. Like, people go there to protest and throw stones, and there's always, people get injured. And we always thought, oh, you're lucky, that you just injured, that, you wouldn't shot in the head. But in fact, that now seems to have always been the logic of the Israeli state, which is to inflict as much debility. Because, eventually, again, there is no difference between the debility of a person, of an individual in Gaza, and the overarching debility that the entire Gazan population has had to endure. Because, you have to see those in continuity with each other. Because, like I said, when I describe my story of how I left Gaza, it seems that this is also a story of debility, a story of somebody who is deprived of any ability to take any action, to, because I'm not in control here. I can't do anything. I'm just an object that's being controlled by those powers. So I'm deprived of my agency, of my ability to take action. And therefore, there is here a close resemblance between physical debility and existential debility, to be somewhat philosophical about it.
No, that's a very good point. Hamad, I have 2 more questions, if that's okay.
Yeah, that's fine. Yeah.
Okay.
As far as Adam doesn't interrupt us.
He can make a small cameo. It's okay. One question I had was related to tweets that you sent out at some point. I actually don't remember when you sent them out, but I will quote them here, and then I'll try and formulate a proper question. So the first is, the left have failed, but more crucially, Britain and the West have become provincialized. For in the triumph in the forces of reaction and ethno-nationalism, the universal claims of the West have been bellied. Hence, the need for a politics out of and beyond the right and left. And then the second one is, along the same lines, but I'll read it anyway. Those who truly care about justice and emancipation ought to be reminded there remains a possibility of politics beyond that of the right and left, beyond the West. A politics where the fate of global minorities does not hinge on the goodwill or malice of Western political elites. And I found that very interesting. And the reason I'm placing it in the context of everything we just spoke about as well, is that we spoke a bit about the wider failures of the global left, and we don't necessarily need to repeat that. But I'm very curious as to to the extent that you can, it will be abstract, obviously, by definition. It will be abstract, probably not easy to think about. But what does a politics out of and beyond, let's say, the right and left, beyond the West, beyond these binaries, essentially, that usually, from the looks of it, don't actually seem to be doing much good on the ground? What can that look like?
Okay, that's I'm not sure if I'm able to actually give a clear answer to this question.
No, I think by definition it will not be clear because it's not possible.
Yes, exactly, and it's hard to really imagine
Yes.
alternatives. But it's, at least we have to start by challenging the again, the hegemonic uh, discourse around us that tells us this is all you've got. It has to be this or that. But when neither this nor that works for me, obviously I have to start and envision a new way, a new politics. Because again, if the right has defined me as the enemy, whether as a Muslim or as a Palestinian from Gaza, or as an Arab, or as an immigrant, or as anything, always the other.
Mm-hmm.
So clearly, for this element, which is very influential, as we have seen, over the past few years, I'm clearly um, they're no allies for me, and therefore I need to revert to the left. But then, the story is um, it's probably it might have worked for me.
Mm-hmm.
When I was first starting to understand the global discourse around Israel-Palestine, but then we realized that there is more to it than just solidarity with the Palestinians. And we know, I'm sorry, I'm not here like questioning any particular individuals. I have absolutely no one in mind, because
Mm-hmm.
I'm just not interested really. I'm interested in discourses. I'm not interested in particular people.
Mm-hmm.
We have realized that this discourse is no less dangerous
Mm-hmm.
than that of the right,
Yeah.
in my opinion, and I stand by that very firmly.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously, I'm not beholden to anyone to agree to either have to ally myself with the right or the left. I don't
Mm-hmm.
see that I'm obligated to do that, or I have, some people sometimes when this is very interesting when you come to Australia, because you start observing these things as well at a much more pronounced scale, because I think, there is more awareness in particular parts of, for example, in London, where, I lived for a year. There is more the sort of political landscape uh, and the solidarity landscape is much more nuanced.
Sure.
Whereas
Yeah.
here, you see that it's absolutely dichotomized between right and left. And then when you interact with the left, you realize how very deeply conservative many of them can be.
Yeah.
And then how, for example, like you're supposed to always play victim and always show gratitude. And I've actually been asked to show gratitude uh, for people who, because they somehow work hard to save me. And yes, it's serious. It's true. Like this
I
actually
believe you.
happens. Yeah, it actually happens. And then this only leaves you wondering. I really don't understand what the distinction between right and left is supposed to signify. Now I'm talking here from my perspective. Now I understand that, the rich and the poor, the proletariat and the bourgeoisie, and we understand all these things. It makes sense within the particular societies, within a particular context. But to try and project this globally and say that the entire world, that, for example, Palestine is a struggle of the, workers. Isn't Syria the struggle of workers? No, it's not. It's a conspiracy. That's what I'm saying here. It becomes illogical. It's just not. It's me in English. I can't buy into this. So this obviously leaves me disenchanted with both. Obviously, we saw Corbyn. We saw, I mean, you're deeply familiar with this,
Sure. Yeah.
probably. Yeah. So once again, that means the right and the left distinction becomes superfluous. That means, okay, we need to envision a new way for the victims of imperialism. And that's what I speak from a subaltern perspective. I speak from my perspective. That's the only perspective I can speak from. The only problem is that some people think that they can speak from a universal perspective, a perspective that applies to everyone. And I find that flawed and problematic, because these people somehow see themselves as standing on some morally universal ground that they, and if they fail to see their own limitations. So I'm in no way to dictate to others what's best for them. but looking at it from the perspective of a subaltern, from my perspective as a Palestinian, but also from the perspective of people who suffered the woes of uh, American and European colonialism and imperialism in the Middle East and in the global South more broadly.
Mm-hmm.
I don't see that, right and left really makes much difference for us. In Syria, we have seen that. In Egypt, we have seen that. Yes, we have seen that in Egypt, probably to a lesser extent, but we've
Mm-hmm.
seen it everywhere. And therefore, okay, we need a new way. Now, one way to talk about that, obviously, I might have to be a little bit more academic about it, but simply to start envisioning a world order that is not fully based on the supremacy of one global superpower. Again, so we need a multipolar world where, because I believe in power. I mean, if I've learned anything from the experiences that I've had in my life, you need power. Because it's good to have power, because that's how the world works. And when I talk about power, I mean power for political representation. Obviously, I'm not represented. I'm stateless. I'm not a citizen of any country. So I see it as rather quite self-evident that I would like some form of self-representation, that I don't want just to be spoken on behalf of. I don't want just to be a victim. I'd like my people and all victims to have some sort of representation. It seems to me that the world is absolutely unequal in the way it is divided into first, second, and third. And obviously, that's not just in terms of economic and material access to opportunities, but also just the very fact that my life is worth more, is more valuable just because I don't live in Gaza anymore. It just, it tells me so much about the world order and how some lives are more valued, automatically more valued than others, just depending on your locality. So if you're Palestinian and you die, just a number, it doesn't really matter. Yeah, we might feel sorry and sad, but that's it. But I'm sorry, a person died, a family is shattered, all this. Okay, we just, protest. That's not enough for me. I'm beyond this. Or when somebody says, like, all the stories that we know, like you mentioned Kashmir. So it's not just about, obviously, Arabs as well, in my opinion.
Of course.
Or obviously we have to talk about Iraq as well. And we can't really name every context, but the issue here is that we need some form of political representation. And I feel that the world order as it stands, where, the very idea of global governance for me is meaningless, just to put it very bluntly. It's just a form of administering those differences in a way that ultimately is designed to ensure the best for, the West.
Yeah.
Eventually, what is a Security Council that is made of the US that has a veto power, or Russia that has a veto power? And there is no form of representation for any of the colonial subjects or the, formerly colonial, why? How equal is this? So we try and say it's global governance, but I look at the structure of the Security Council, it's just utterly political. And therefore, we try and say it's no longer about, this is just about human rights. Yes, but I mean, we say people have human rights. Do they? I mean, ideals are great, that people should have human rights. That's wonderful. We all agree on that. The question is, do people have human rights? And when I say people, all people. And obviously the answer is a definite no. So that means we have to, basically, I have no faith in the world order as it exists. I'm not saying I think it will change or it can change, but at least the least we can do is advocate or start to envision, start to talk about this as this is the real issue, the fundamental issue here. That we've been told, we're no longer going to have to fight. We're no longer going to have, it's just post-political age, they called it, the end of politics. Just all get together, form a global governance, United Nations, the World Health Organization, the World Labour Organization, all these beautiful things that we were told this is how it's going to be. But then we have realized that this is ultimately just another way to continue to practice, to continue to dominate and exercise control over the world population.
Mm-hmm.
I'm never finishing.
Yeah, I know.
We're almost done.
Okay, all right, I finished. I think we're finishing now. Sorry.
Okay. The last question is going back a bit more on the personal side. I'm speaking to you from Geneva, so I'm only just 1 hour behind Lebanon, and already not sometimes, quite a lot of the times I struggle because I'm not there. So I have this need to be physically there, even though I can be totally useless if I'm there. But it's just this instinct that I need to be there, try and be useful, help out the family. Most of my family is still back home. Obviously, in the context of the economic crisis and the COVID-19 crisis, it's kind of created a sort of a perfect storm right now in Lebanon. So my question to you is more: you've left now. It's been over 5 years, more or less. I think you mentioned that you haven't traveled, so you haven't left Australia. How have you managed to deal with the fact that you're so far from home right now and for so long?
There's just no other way. There's no other. Yeah, there's nothing. Yeah, that's the only thing that's available to me. As I mentioned, Joey, it's not easy, obviously, being far away from home. But yeah. On the other hand, going back to Gaza is not really an option, given that since I left, if anything, things have just gotten much worse.
Yeah.
And I mean that, like, it always gets worse, but it has gotten to a point that even I can't imagine what it would be like if I go back to Gaza. Because it's always just been going in a tragic, like the stories that I've heard, for example, like, there hasn't been a major, I mean, there were like a couple of sporadic, sort of so-called escalations, but there's just you can't really see a future in Gaza. Like, it's really hard. Like, people live just for the day. So despite the fact that I have family and my whole life is back home, it would be literally like committing suicide if somebody decides to go back to Gaza, because you're just again turning yourself into turning in, like, you're going back to prison willingly. And it's not that you will probably live and have a nice life, but the issue is that you will be absolutely powerless. You will have absolutely no ability to exercise any agency, to say anything, or like, I just can't imagine how, unless you want to be turned into a passive object that is again incapable of creating any change. I understand, like, a lot of people do that, obviously, if you're there, it's a different story, because you just have to accept that you're there, and therefore you have to do the best you could do, and that's what a lot of people have been doing. And for me, that's the real struggle. Like, I understand all the solidarity, all the movements and all that, but the real struggle is the real people who just exist on the ground. This is like the continuity of life itself is the most powerful declaration of existence. The fact that people continue to live, the fact that people continue to celebrate Eid, for example, they get together, they do things. So there is life continues. And that for me is the real struggle. The fact that Palestinians will always exist no matter what. Mm-hmm. There is no way, just, for me, and that's also the relief that one gets, like, despite everything, despite all the suffering, we just know that we are always going to be here. Palestinians are always going to be there, because what are you going to do? Exterminate them? I mean, Israel has tried to exterminate them, but just You have 2 million people. It's sad because our lives, like I said, are not very valuable or valued in terms of, almost every day a Palestinian loses their lives, um, and not much really happens. Like, all these lives could be saved. But the point again is that this is a struggle. This is a struggle for existence. And that is, for me, where the real conversation should take place. So, and that's where also, if you want to bring it back to the left and to solidarity, that's where I think these people don't get it. Like, yes, what you do is great, it's wonderful, but you have to understand that the real liberation, the real struggle is always there on the ground. It's the people. It's not, I hear some people like, America should do this or Iran should do that. Yes, that's all great. But ultimately, it's the Palestinian people themselves that are enacting that struggle. It's not Iran, it's not America, it's not Turkey. It's the Palestinian people. And yeah, for me, we're Palestinian. Our identity will always continue to exist. There is no way you can obliterate history or our existence as a people. Yes, maybe we don't have a state. Yes, we don't have autonomy or sovereignty, but we exist because we know who we are. We know our history. So even if my son was born in Australia, he's 5 years, we already, talk about Palestine, talk about Gaza, talk about history, inculcate our existence. And that is something that you cannot defeat. How can you defeat that? So we can talk about solutions, we can talk about everything, but ultimately that's where it all lies, So it doesn't really matter. We just accept that this is how it's going to be for Palestinians, and everybody who, understands that, they just do their best in order to stay true to the people, to the struggle, to the demands for, that's why we also find it hard to be committed to one narrative, and that's why it's easy, in my opinion, for somebody like for a Palestinian or, somebody like you, for example, to be able to identify with different struggles so easily. We're not challenged by an alternative worldview, and that's the issue. Like, whereas someone who's not really immersed in those struggles, and for them is probably something they want to engage with, which is wonderful, to be able to engage and be active and understand how the world works, and try to do the right thing, but also always understand your limitations and understand that your positionality in comparison to those people, to the people that you want to show solidarity, be in solidarity with, or something like that. So again, it's a fine line, between saying I support Palestinians and trying to speak on behalf of Palestinians. So yes, just knowing your limit. And I see a lot of people just make careers out of that. But again, I understand that a lot of people are genuinely motivated, but I also have suspicions not about the people, but about the motives and about the consequences of this form. So it becomes Palestinians ultimately in this ongoing conversation. Like I said, they're objects. They don't talk. Like, most of what's going on, Palestinians don't actually have a voice. And of course, when we talk about Palestinians, which Palestinians as well are we talking about? Are we talking about refugees? Are we talking about people in Gaza and the West Bank? Are we talking about people in the refugee camps in Yarmouk, in Syria and Lebanon? Or are we talking about third generation refugees all over the world? Which is, again, all of them are equally Palestinian, but whose voices? So these are all questions that we need always to think about. And I think it's important that, people like you, Joey, like, those podcasts, I think that's really important to do, to raise as much awareness of these, issues as possible.
Well, on that note, Muhammad, Thank you a lot for your time.
No worries, Joey. Thank you for having me. It's been great talking to you.
Same here.